everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I'm getting ready to work with this month's cards, tags, and more kit from Tres Jolie Kit Club. And just to go over what is in this month's kit, you will find some ink from Prima in Vermilion, a pack of little flowers from 49 and Market, some Tres Jolie Chipboard, a pack of dressed in trim also from Prima, some envelope and little note card size blanks, a craft die set from Creative Expressions. The pack has 2 dies in it, the outline die just for the overall shape, and then an inner die which only makes cutouts. It doesn't have an outer edge. And then there are some 6x6 sheets of pattern paper. The idea I'm working on, it doesn't have a lot of, I guess you might say, technical difficulties in it. It's really a lot more busy work, gluing, cutting, measuring again, finding out you measured wrong. Maybe that's just me. So I'm going to voice over and speed up through this process because, like I said, a lot more busy work than technical difficulties for this little journal blank that I decided I needed to make. And what it really was is what triggered the idea is the die set that came in the kit. For some reason, as soon as I saw that die, the only thing I could think of was that using the decorative inner cut of it would just be really awesome looking on the spine of a book. So, how do I put this? The die is what determined the width of my spine. If the die had been more narrow, I would have had a more narrow spine. If it had been wider, well, fortunately it wasn't, because I just about lost my mind trying to sew all the pages together for the width that I do have. The little note cards in the kit are actually really very sturdy, especially folded in half, and they were the perfect size to line up with that die. And that's what my covers are made out of, is just 2 of the note cards. I kept them folded in half, so, basically doubled up. And that was to create the book cover base, or the base of the book cover. I just used some blank mixed media paper that I have lying around. I have a pretty hefty supply of blank paper, or that's what I used for my signatures. The pages inside is just that blank mixed media paper. You could use whatever kind of papers you have. Change the width, don't use the die, make it wider. I decided on that wood plank paper to use as my spine wrap around onto the cover. You can see the papers, the one with the wreath is on the front cover, and then the back side of another one of those wreath pattern sheets is my back cover. Okay, so since the note cards are about 6 inches high and the papers are 6 inches tall, which means I had to piece together my cover. I needed something to wrap over the top and the bottom edges of my book covers. So I decided for the top and the bottom edge of my book covers, I added extra strips. So part of the cover that I needed to work out was how to cut the main paper for the front cover. I wanted as much of the wreath as I could get to remain a focal point on the front. So I did my best to figure out how I could center that wreath, at least to have the majority of it right on the front. Given that I was going to have an inch of the wood plank paper wrap around, that left me, I think, like 3 inches or so left of cover to center that on. And the circle on this pattern paper is a 3-inch circle. So I cut up along one edge. That edge is the one that I would put up against the wood plank paper coming around from the spine. And then I went over 4 inches and just cut off another 1/2 inch. And that gave me the 3 inches or so to keep that circle of the wreath on my cover. And then the extra inch would be just to wrap around the back cover. Not a lot to worry about there, so I just cut it down to size. And then because I needed to trim off a little bit off the top and a little bit off the bottom for my front and back covers so that I could add on a larger piece that I would be able to wrap around. Once again, using my front cover as the basis so that I could keep as much of the wreath on there as well as keeping it centered on there. I just basically cut off the majority of the pattern paper that didn't have a lot of the wreath on it. If that makes sense, that's what I'm doing. I just tried to figure out how to keep as much of the wreath and the foliage on there while keeping it centered on the front. And then just came in for the back cover and trimmed off the same amount that I had trimmed off of the wreath patterned paper for the front cover. And then I grabbed up the paper that I planned on using to add to the top and the bottom for my wraparounds on my cover. Figured out which parts of the pattern that I wanted sticking up off of the larger pieces, the main pieces of my cover, and then just cut it down to size. Cut enough so that I could have a little bit of overlap when I pieced it together so it would hold together. Tried to work out and determine how everything would look. It was really a lot of fiddly work right here. I'm just going to call it fiddly work. Well, I just played around with the papers, just trying to figure out what I wanted showing on my covers. After I had the extension pieces cut out, I lined them up, made sure that everything was going to go together and I'd have enough to wrap around my book cover bases. And then I just ran a thin line of glue to hold the extension pieces to the main focal point pieces. After I decided to add a little bit of definition between the two papers that I was piecing together, so I grabbed up the ink from the kit and just inked around the top and the bottom edges of the main cover papers. And there they are, the more or less finished cover papers, or at least put together, pieced together, front and back cover papers. All right, so the same problem that I had with the papers for the covers, I had to rectify for the spine, and that was I needed a little extra paper to wrap around the top and the bottom. So I pieced together 2 sheets of that wood plank pattern paper, and I tried to kind of eyeball line up the planks on them a little bit, just so it would create a more continuous design, or at least try to create a more continuous design. I tried to make it so that the seam of the two papers together would be as close to center as I could make them while still keeping them as lined up as I could. So I made a little mark on the center of my cover to use as my guideline for finding the center of where the two spine papers needed to come together. And after I had everything together, I just made sure that my edges were all cut down straight and everything was to the correct size. Which in this case, my whole spine section is 4 inches wide, 2 inches for the spine, 1 inch to wrap around onto the front cover, and 1 inch to wrap around onto the back cover. Lined up the seam on the spine papers with the center of the cover papers, just to make sure I did have overlap. Came in here, added a second layer of varnish to my papers, added varnish to the spine, and now I am just brushing on PVA glue to seal up the 2 note cards I am using for the cover bases. I had thought about using double-sided tape because the moisture from the PVA glue will warp the paper a bit, but I also knew that there would be more moisture coming in when I put everything together. So I was really hoping that by the time I glued down the cover papers and the inside papers, then it would just sort of straighten itself out. And I'm happy to say that it did. By the time everything is said and done, my cover is actually relatively straight, even though it is made out of paper and nothing particularly substantial like a chipboard. I made sure the edges were straight. You know how sometimes when things have a fold in them or with the glue, it might have shifted just a hair one way or another. I just wanted to clean up any edges that might have been a little off. I added some more varnish here at the seams of the papers that would be folding over, just to help give them a little bit more endurance for when they do get wrapped around, and protection just because it is the cover. And now for one of my more fiddly diddly time consuming parts, and that was cutting all of my mixed media paper down to size. My sheets are 9 by 12, so I am able to cut 2 pages out of each sheet, and then I score them in the middle. You can see here, this is about the gap between the cover and the edge of the mixed media paper. It's only a couple millimeters on the top, bottom, and outer edge. This is the overall size of the papers, and now it is just a matter of cutting, folding, and putting my signatures together. Each of my signatures has 4 sheets in it because the mixed media paper is a little heavier. If it was a thinner paper like book page paper for junk journals or something, I would probably be able to do 5, but the mixed media paper is a little heavier, so 4 it is. And in the end, I ended up with 16 signatures of 4 pages each, for a total of 64 sheets folded in half, so 128 pages in the book, or 256 if you want to count the front and back sides, something like that. It's got a few pages in it. And then I lined up my die along the center of my spine paper, cleaned it out, and worked out what I wanted to back that die cut with. I liked the contrast of this lighter paper behind the darker wood grain on there. And to add a little bit of shine, I added some of the dressed-in trim, and I just used the top connector that is there to hold them all together while I got it in place. That way I wouldn't have to try to lay all of the pieces back out. After it was in place, then I figured out exactly how many I would need to show, popped off the 2 outer edge ones just because they were unnecessary for the die cut section, and then randomly trimmed down the rest of the pieces and just added a light touch of glue to hold them in place so they wouldn't accidentally tear, and so that I could keep them straight when the time came to put everything together. And there you can see how it will eventually look when all is said and done, with just that little bit of gold peeking through. To seal up my Tres Jolie chipboard, I just added some varnish to the front and the back. That sealed up the chipboard and sealed up the soot on there. And now the time has come to create my text block. I have my template made for all of my holes. I have 5 holes in here. I cut my template to the height of the signatures, and then to find all of my centers, I just folded that template in half to find the center, and then folded the top and the bottom edges in half at the top and bottom holes to create the other 2 holes, the centers of the top half and the center of the bottom half, if that's making sense. You can see there in the video kind of what I'm trying to explain. And then I prepared my signatures, poked the holes through all of them, and the clips aren't really there for anything except to just keep them from sliding around on me. I don't have them clipped together in any particular fashion. It's just that those clips could only hold so much, and my signatures kept sliding apart, and it was frustrating me. And then I stitched all of these together and created my text block. I will add links in the description box of a couple of different places that is specifically for this type of text block stitching together, which is really just the more traditional means of sewing text blocks together. If you know the Coptic stitch, it's really very similar to that. And to do all of my stitching, I just used embroidery floss, 2 strands of embroidery floss for this. I needed to create my end papers so that they would cover the inside of the covers, and then also be the same size as the signatures, about a 4-inch cover and 4-inch wide pages. So I kept the full 6 inches of one of the sheets and then just added in a couple extra edges, paper piecing my end papers together. And just sort of to mock put it together to make sure they were going the way I wanted them to. I just held everything together, and you can see how those end papers are going to look inside the cover and on that text block once everything is said and done. And then, because I obviously had not done enough stitching for the day, I decided I wanted to just add a simple straight stitch, the full 6 strands of embroidery floss along the seam of my piece together end papers. I pre-poked my sewing holes just so I could try to keep the stitches as evenly as possible. I eyeballed about how far in I wanted the line of stitching, and I poked a hole about every 1/4 inch or so all the way down, and then just did that simple straight stitch along it. I didn't want a knot lump on this page or on the pages, so I used double-sided tape just to temporarily hold the thread in place, and then came through, made sure that double-sided tape, I kind of just scraped it up and made it almost wrap around the ends of the thread that I had used to hold it down. Added a line of art glitter glue, and on the back side of the stitching, which in my case, this is the side of the page that will be against the first and last signature pages, and just very carefully put down some of that Dresden trim to cover up the back side of my stitches and just add a little extra texture and shine in this little sketchbook journal. Whatever you make yours for. Mine, I have blank pages, so probably more like a sketchbook. And now it is time for me to put the text block and the end papers together. I am just using a piece of super, which is just the traditional book binding fabric. If you have some thinner scrap fabric lying around, say like bedsheet, pillowcases, that type of fabric, you could use that as well. I would personally just say stick with natural fibers like cottons or linens, just because you can't always guarantee how well glue might stick to a synthetic fabric, to try to help facilitate keeping things straight. The signatures in the text block can kind of shift, so I just gently tapped it with a flat surface, that small acrylic block, just to do my best to get everything evened back out. Stuck it between my little homemade bookbinding boards, which is just a couple of plywood pieces that I wrapped freezer paper around. There, I forgot the word I was looking for. I wrapped freezer paper around. Used a couple of clamps that I had hijacked from my husband temporarily. Created a spacer. This is just some scrap, like poster board type stuff I had within reaching distance, and I cut it to a 1.5 inch width because I knew that was how wide my signatures should be, I guess I should say. And then I just used it to make sure that I had a 1.5 inch space at the top and the bottom. That way I knew that I didn't have one end or the other more tightly clamped. And then I came in with my PVA glue and started with one light layer of it. Added my super, added a layer of glue onto the super. I work in thin layers. The PVA glue, especially in thin layers, it dries quickly, and I would at least let it mostly kind of dry, maybe dry for 5 minutes or so before adding the next layer. That's just so that I don't accidentally overdo the glue, get any in between the signatures, and, you know, inadvertently glue things together that shouldn't be. So while I waited for my PVA glue to dry on the spine, I started putting the cover together. I trimmed down my inner paper with the Dresden trim on it to the width I needed. I'm trying to make sure that my Dresden trim I had on there was centered, trimming off whatever I needed from the edges. I think that the two outer edges of the Dresden trim were barely cut, but I still wanted to make it centered so that one side didn't have more cut off than the other. I didn't have one side that had like a partial and the other side have a whole, just because it is a very snug fit, very precise, not a lot of wiggle room between that background paper, which is a 1.5 inch width, and the width of the die cut and the width of the spine. Like I said, a lot of this, it's not a particularly difficult task, but it was a lot of measuring and just fiddly work and double checking measurements and trying to get everything to almost look like I knew what I was doing. Used the PVA glue to coat my wood grain outer spine paper, and I just brushed it on. That way I could kind of dab around with the die cuts, and I used the PVA glue because it remains flexible when it's dry. And since my spine is a little bit of a bendy spine, I needed that flexibility. And then to seal up the spine, to make sure that the decorative die cutting was sealed down, that it wouldn't get caught on anything, I added a layer of varnish. Now I am putting all of my book cover papers together so that I can add it to the book cover note cards. I have my lines in place to make sure that everything stays centered. That's what those little marks are there on the note cards. And using PVA glue once again, coated my note cards and got my papers down in place. Wrapped my edges around, not gluing them down yet, just so that I would know where my folds were going to be. Trimmed the corners out some. Marked the centers on the covers so that I would have something to line the spine center up with. Trimmed my spine down to about 1 1/8 inch from the edge of the paper to the edge of the decorative section. Because my decorative section is the 1.5 inches to match up with the 1.5 inch text block, I used that as my measuring point, and I went 1 1/8 inch so that I could have my 1 inch, and this is also how I did it without having to put spacers in between. I knew I only had 1 inch between the cover sheets on the card, so lining up the edge of the wood grain spine paper with the edge of the pattern paper for the covers left me that 1/8 inch gap in between so that my spine would bend. I pushed everything down, made sure there were no air pockets, made sure everything was folding the way I wanted it to, trimmed down the top and the bottom of the spine paper so that it just matched the edges of the cover paper, and started the gluing process so that I could wrap everything around using PVA glue again. Notched out at the bends in the book cover so that I didn't have any extra bulk where the bends were. I didn't realize that I had that inner piece a little bit extra too long, so I lightly used my craft knife to cut through the layers of it so that I could just kind of peel it up a little bit at a time before making that final fold. And then because this is all paper, I decided just to reinforce my bends using some linen hinging tape. You could probably use packing tape if you wanted to, maybe some lighter paper if you wanted to, cloth medical tape, paper medical tape. And my cover is done, and then all I have left to do is to stick that text block in there. But before I got that far, I don't exactly have a big chunky paper cutter to cut through 1.5 inches worth of a text block, so I clamped it together and just made a makeshift sanding block just to try to even out a little bit. It's not exactly perfect. I don't really mind it being imperfect. I just want to hold this closed real quick. There we go, just like that, just for stability. And I'm gonna get my headband and footband, double headband. I'm going to get them on anyhow, using the same PVA glue. And these are homemade headbands. You can use like twill tape. I'll link the video for making your own headbands that I had come across when I learned about it. And then after my headbands are in place, I'm going to attach my text block to my cover. My little journal is glued together. Everything is mostly working the way I planned. It opens, nothing stuck together. It's a win. I am going to just use these little alpha stamps that I've had for all eternity. They're there. They're just little Hampton art alpha stamps. And I lined up the letters to spell journal, and I just taped them together to help hold them. And now, to keep it at least semi-straight, I'm just going to go at the center, and I know where the center is because I have that seam there. And I already measured out from my seam. I'm going to go down 2 3/4 inches, and that'll about center it along there. The edge of the block for the J, I'm going to put along the edge of the wood grain print paper because it works out centered this way. I eyeballed that part. It doesn't have to be perfect. It is handmade. It might as well look like it is. I'm going to ink it up with the ink from the kit. And just like that. So now it just has this little hand stamped title across the front. I'm going to let that dry, and I'm going to put some workable fixative on it just because I want to come in with the varnish again and kind of just touch up, and I don't want the varnish to cause any smearing. So after the ink has dried, then I will just come back and do that spray and add a little varnish just for some areas that aren't quite as varnished from my previous experiments as I would have liked. A little rougher looking. And that is that. With that last layer of varnish dry, my little journal sketchbook is complete. I just thought that those little cards in there were just the cutest sizes for a little book. And when I saw this die in the kit, all I could think about was a decorative spine. So here it is. And now I could use this for myself or use it as a stocking stuffer at Christmas time, anything like that. I hope that you enjoyed this little journal project and it gave you some ideas of what you can use those papers and those note cards for besides just doing cards. When they're glued together and then have the 2 layers of paper on them, they are pretty sturdy. I added that chipboard on the front. I didn't really want it on the back just because it's the back and not really going to be seen. And if you have it laid down, then it would be a little more lumpy, I guess. So there's that. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications if you haven't already. Give us a thumbs up and feel free to share this video. Thank you, and I will see you again next week.